I always knew the sound of Evelyn's laughter. It used to echo off our kitchen tiles on Saturday mornings, warm and honest as sunlight. But over the past year, that sound had become more of a ghost, appearing only in the polite corners of conversations and vanishing when it was just the two of us. Still, nothing quite prepared me for hearing it tonight, the way it burst clear and bright from across the crowded gallery. I wasn't supposed to be there. A late-night email from my boss had driven me out of the house to clear my head. I drove aimlessly at first, the city lights blurring into streaks. But when I saw the gallery, its windows aglow and voices filtering out into the street, I pulled over. I remembered Evelyn mentioning it that morning in passing. A new exhibit opening, a local artist with uncontainable energy, as she'd put it, a touch of excitement sparking in her voice. I hadn't heard that tone in years. I didn't think much of it then. But now, standing here, the truth settled in my gut like a stone. Inside, the room hummed with life. Strangers sipped wine and murmured admiring words as they drifted from painting to painting. I spotted her before she saw me, a silhouette framed by deep reds and cool blues splashed across a canvas that seemed to spill out emotions too raw for words. And standing beside her was a man, tall, lean, with hair that fell in tousled waves and a shirt streaked with paint, as if he wore his art like a badge. Adrian. I remembered the name from Evelyn's stories, the way she'd say it with an involuntary lilt, something wistful in her eyes. I used to laugh it off, an indulgent husband who trusted too much. Now, watching him lean in, whispering something that made her laugh. Really laugh. I felt my hands clench into fists. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen her touch his arm as she spoke, hadn't seen the way she tilted her head, eyes alight with a brightness reserved for strangers. But the room seemed to tighten around me, trapping me in this unwanted scene. I took a step back, my shoulder brushing against a woman who turned with an irritated glance. "Sorry," I muttered, not meeting her eyes. I found myself shifting closer to a painting, trying to blend in with the crowd. It was chaotic, a wild mess of colors, but my focus was on Evelyn, who seemed a world away from the woman who still shared my bed, shared my name. What was it that made her so distant lately? The answer stood right beside her, gesturing passionately at the canvas as if it were an extension of his soul. I could see how easily someone like Evelyn, with her hunger for more than routine, would be drawn into that orbit. The artist and his muse, it was almost laughable if it didn't hurt so much. Someone nearby raised a glass in admiration, the sharp clink snapping me out of my trance. Evelyn looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room until, for one tense moment, our eyes met. The smile faltered on her lips, replaced by something I couldn't quite read, shock, guilt, or perhaps something far worse, indifference. I turned before she could come over, heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum announcing truths I wasn't ready to confront. The night air slapped my face as I stepped outside, gulping it in as if it might erase what I'd just seen. But the image was burned into my mind. Evelyn laughing, her fingers brushing his arm, the ghost of us still lingering somewhere behind her eyes. And just like that, I knew. We weren't in a rough patch. We were in the eye of a storm, one that had been building for longer than I cared to admit. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the dining room table, eyes tracing the knots in the wood, the slight warps in the surface that we used to joke about needing to fix but never did. The silence was loud, stretching from the hallway to the living room where shadows loomed, thrown by the street lamp outside. Evelyn hadn't come home yet. Each tick of the wall clock gnawed at my resolve. At 2:14 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of her key sliding into the lock, a pause, then the soft creak of the door. I didn't move. My heart thudded like a traitor in my chest, louder than the quiet click of her heels. I heard her stop just inside the door, her breath a whisper in the dark. She wasn't expecting me awake. When she turned on the light, her gasp was small, almost lost in the room's heavy air. Our eyes met, and in that moment, there was no pretending, no fumbled explanations, just the truth standing raw between us. "You're still up?" Her voice was tentative, but she tried to sound casual. She slipped off her shoes and set them neatly by the door, a habit of hers that suddenly felt irritatingly practiced. I couldn't sleep, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I didn't know where to begin, so I asked what felt safest. How was the gallery? A flicker of something crossed her face, surprise, maybe, that I knew. It didn't last long. She walked into the kitchen, opening the fridge more for distraction than thirst. It was fine, she said, her back turned as if that could hide the quiver in her words. Fine, I repeated, standing so abruptly that my chair scraped the floor. She flinched at the sound, and something twisted inside me, guilt and anger vying for control. I don't know what you're looking for, Michael. She turned around, the light catching the slight smudge of makeup beneath her eyes, the flush still warming her cheeks. My mind flashed back to the gallery, to Adrian's smile, to her laughter. It was all too much. Who is he, Evelyn? The question shot out before I could temper it, jagged and raw. It hung in the space between us, a challenge neither of us could dodge. Her mouth opened as if to answer, but no words came. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. My fingers curled in a fist at my sides, and I hated how my voice shook when I spoke again. I saw you, at the gallery, with him. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, conjure some flimsy excuse. But then her shoulders slumped, the fight seeping out of her. Michael, it's not what you think. Don't, I said, the word heavy final. Don't lie to me. A tear traced down her cheek, slow and deliberate. It started as nothing, just conversation. He made me feel what? I interrupted, the rage splintering into something more painful. Feel alive? Is that it? I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. And I don't? It's not that simple, she whispered, looking down as if the answer might be hiding in the floorboards. I watched her, the woman I'd built a life with, suddenly a stranger. The room felt colder, emptier. Maybe it isn't, I admitted, the exhaustion settling in. The fight left my voice, replaced by something hollow. But I need to know if there's anything left here worth saving. She met my eyes then, and I saw it, the hesitation, the doubt, the unspoken words trapped between what we had been and what we had become. And that was when I knew. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The next morning came gray and heavy, the sky hanging low with the threat of rain. Evelyn had slept in the guest room. Or at least, that's where she retreated after our confrontation. I doubted either of us really slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting as headlights passed outside. My mind replayed the scene in loops, searching for clues, missed signs, anything that would make sense of what felt like an unraveling. By the time the first hint of dawn bled through the curtains, I had given up on sleep entirely. I padded into the kitchen, the cold tiles biting at my feet. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint rattle of the wind against the window, all of it was the same as yesterday, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore. I made coffee more out of habit than need, the bitter scent filling the silence. When Evelyn appeared, I was pouring my second cup. She looked fragile, like the slightest touch might shatter her. Her hair was pulled back, a messy bun that seemed thrown together in haste. The smudges under her eyes spoke of a night as restless as mine. We stood in the same room, a chasm of unspoken words stretching between us. "Can we talk?" she said softly, voice cracking at the edges. I nodded, motioning to the chair across from me. The kitchen table felt like neutral ground, though the tension made it feel like a battlefield. She sat, fingers lacing and unlacing as she stared at the tabletop, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know where to start," she admitted finally. "Try the truth," I said, the words sharper than I intended. I took a breath, forcing myself to be steady. I deserve that much. Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "It started months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I met him at a friend's gathering. At first, it was innocent, just talking about art and life and things I hadn't thought about in years. He made me remember what it felt like to be seen. I flinched at that, my mind stumbling over the implications. And what about me? I asked, bitterness tightening my throat. Did I just become invisible? It's not like that, Michael. She finally looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never meant for this to happen. I never thought I'd cross that line, but somewhere along the way I did. A silence thicker than fog filled the space between us. I gripped my mug, fingers turning white around the ceramic. So, what now? The question came out ragged, a plea more than a demand. Do you love him? She looked down, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. That was answer enough. The pain settled into something deeper, a cold ache that seeped into my bones. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I fought the urge to shout, to shake the table, and demand she tell me this was all a horrible mistake. But I didn't, because it wasn't. I don't know what I feel, she said finally, voice quivering. But I know that what we have now isn't enough. It hasn't been for a long time. The honesty cut through me like glass, sharp and unforgiving. I thought of the years we'd spent building this life, the shared dinners, the long weekends, the quiet nights reading side by side. How had we ended up here, in this mess of hurt and betrayal? I stood up, the chair scraping back loudly, breaking the moment. Evelyn's eyes followed me, wide and brimming. I need some time, I said, my voice distant, as if someone else were speaking. Time to figure out if there's anything left worth fighting for. She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek, catching the morning light like a shard of glass. Neither of us moved as I turned and walked out, the weight of that final look pressing down on me, anchoring me to a past that felt like it was slipping away. Outside, the sky opened up, rain streaming down in silvery sheets. It felt right, as if the world itself understood that everything was falling apart. The rain didn't let up for days, drumming against the windows and turning the garden into a slick patch of mud. It mirrored the mood inside the house, relentless and cold. Evelyn and I moved around each other like strangers, the quiet between us now filled with the awareness of all we hadn't said and couldn't unhear. Each glance was weighted with questions we weren't ready to ask, each breath marked by the presence of an uninvited third party who loomed in the spaces between us. The house, once a haven, now felt like a museum filled with relics of a life we no longer lived. Photos lined the hallway, snapshots of vacations where our smiles were wide and untroubled, the moments before life pulled at the edges of our happiness. I avoided looking at them, but one morning, when the rain had finally slowed to a mist and the world felt quieter, I caught Evelyn standing there, fingers ghosting over a picture from our honeymoon. The sight clenched something deep in my chest. I had to leave. The walls were closing in, the air too thick with questions I couldn't ask without tearing at old wounds. I grabbed my keys, the jingle breaking the silence like a glass shattering on tile. Evelyn turned, startled, eyes wide and rimmed red. I didn't wait for her to say anything. Going for a drive, I muttered, and before the weight of her stare could pull me back, I walked out into the pale morning. The streets were slick, reflecting the muted sky like polished steel. I drove without a destination, letting the road unspool ahead of me while my mind raced in all directions. I thought of the years Evelyn and I had spent together, the promises whispered in darkened rooms, and the laughter shared over late-night movies. When had we become this? Two people bound not by love, but by the inertia of what once was. I found myself in front of a coffee shop we used to frequent, a small place with mismatched chairs and the best cinnamon rolls in town. We hadn't been there in years. Life and work had buried it beneath layers of maybe next weekends. I sat at a corner table, the scent of coffee mingling with memories I'd almost forgotten. A young couple sat near the window, their heads close, fingers brushing as they talked. I looked away, the sight too familiar, too painful. The barista set down my coffee, and I nodded absently, tracing the rim of the mug as if it held answers. "You all right?" a voice asked. I looked up to see an old friend, Jeremy, someone I hadn't seen since we'd drifted apart after college. His hair was thinner, and laugh lines creased his eyes, but he wore the same easy smile. "Jeremy," I said, surprised at how my own voice sounded. raw and uncertain. "Yeah, I'm here." He laughed, a short, knowing sound. "That's half the battle, right?" He slid into the chair across from me without asking, the way friends do when they know you need company more than you need solitude. For a while, we talked about nothing, work, old memories, his kids' latest antics. But he must have noticed my distracted nods, the way I kept glancing at the rain-streaked window. Finally, his smile faded, replaced by concern. "Something's wrong," he said. It wasn't a question. I met his eyes, the weight of the past days pressing on me like a hand to my chest. "I think my marriage is falling apart," I said, the confession heavy and unfamiliar. Jeremy's expression shifted, sympathy softening his features. He didn't rush with platitudes or cliches. He just listened, the way good friends do. I told him about the gallery, Evelyn's distance, the storm that had unraveled what I thought was unbreakable. "You need to find out what you want," he said after a long pause. "Not just what she wants or what happened. You. Because if you don't know that, then you're going to stay lost." I sat back, the truth of it hitting harder than I expected. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe I could see through it. Maybe. Returning home that afternoon felt like stepping into a house I no longer recognized. The silence was different now, heavier, as if it were holding its breath. I placed my keys on the counter and noticed Evelyn's coat draped over the arm of the chair, a splash of soft fabric that felt strangely out of place. For a moment, I wondered if she had left, taken what little courage she had left, and walked out the door. But then I heard her upstairs, the creak of floorboards giving her away. I stood at the bottom of the staircase, debating whether to call out or stay in the safety of the unspoken. In the end, I climbed the steps, each creak an accusation, a reminder of every moment that had led us here. The bedroom door was open, just a sliver, and through it I saw her sitting on the edge of the bed. She was staring at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around and around, as if the simple circle could unravel the knot of guilt and confusion between us. The sight pulled something taut inside me, a mix of anger, sadness, and something else. Hope, maybe, or just a ghost of it. She looked up as I entered, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed. We said nothing for what felt like an eternity. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, but the storm inside us raged on. "I thought you might not come back," she finally said, her voice thin as a whisper. I swallowed. The question she wasn't asking pressing against my chest. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. The honesty tasted strange, raw, like I'd scraped it from the bottom of my soul. But I couldn't leave it like this. Not without trying to understand. Her fingers stilled, and she dropped her gaze. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Michael. I swear I didn't." A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "I don't even know when it started slipping away, when we started slipping away." I sat down in the chair by the window, the old leather creaking under my weight. I've been asking myself the same thing. The memories were sharp now. The late nights at work, the dinners we shared in silence, each of us with our phones in hand, worlds apart. The tiny, invisible betrayals that added up to this. "I needed something more," she said, and the pain in her voice cut through me like glass. "Not because you weren't enough, but because I wasn't enough. I don't even know who I am anymore, Michael. I haven't for a long time." The admission hit me harder than I expected. I thought the answers would be simpler. Selfishness, thrill-seeking, something black and white. But this messy, complicated reality was worse. It was shared failure, a slow drifting apart neither of us had fought hard enough to stop. "What about him?" I asked, my jaw tight. The name felt like poison. "Adrian." She flinched, the tension in her posture cracking like ice. "It was never what you think." Yes, it was wrong, and it crossed lines that should never be crossed, but it wasn't love, Michael. It was a reflection, a way to see myself differently. Did it help? The question was cold, unforgiving, but I needed the answer. No, her voice trembled. It made everything worse. I kept hoping it would fill the emptiness, but it only made me feel more lost. We sat there, the afternoon light casting long shadows that split the room in two. Part of me wanted to hold her, to try to piece together what was broken. The other part wanted to walk out and never look back. Both parts felt equally true, equally impossible. I don't know where we go from here, I said finally, the weight of the truth settling around us like an unwelcome guest. Evelyn's eyes met mine, searching for something, forgiveness, understanding, a second chance. I didn't know if I could give her any of it. But as the sun dipped behind the clouds and the light softened, I realized that not knowing was still better than the numbness we'd let replace us. The days that followed were a limbo I wouldn't wish on anyone. Evelyn and I moved around the house like two dancers out of sync, steps cautious, avoiding the places where memories might trip us up. I found myself studying her when she wasn't looking, searching for clues in the curve of her mouth, the tilt of her head. She seemed smaller now, as if carrying the weight of everything unsaid had whittled her down. One morning, as I sat nursing a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, the silence was interrupted by the chime of her phone on the kitchen counter. We both glanced at it reflexively. The screen lit up with a name I knew too well. Adrian. I felt a sharp twist in my chest, a mix of jealousy and the bitter tang of reality. She looked at me, eyes wide, caught between panic and apology. "You should answer it," I said, my voice steady but cold. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. If we were going to claw our way out of this, I needed to know where we stood, where she stood. Evelyn hesitated, fingers trembling as she reached for the phone. She pressed a button, silencing it without answering. The kitchen seemed to exhale, tension shifting from the air back into my muscles. She let out a shaky breath, placing the phone face down, a silent declaration. "I blocked him last night," she said softly, not meeting my eyes. "I was trying to close that chapter. I didn't think he'd still try to reach out." I stared at her, trying to gauge the sincerity behind the words. Was this remorse or damage control? The line between the two was so thin it blurred into nothingness. "Why now?" I asked, voice low, the question scraping in my throat. "Why decide that now is when you shut the door?" Evelyn's gaze finally lifted, searching my face for some sign of hope or acceptance. "Because I realized I was losing more than I thought I would. Because I watched you leave that day and felt like I'd torn apart the only real thing in my life." Her voice wavered, each syllable weighed down with exhaustion. I wanted to believe her, to reach out and pull her into an embrace that would erase the past months. But betrayal doesn't fade with words. It lingers, gnaws at the spaces between sentences and touches. Still, there was a spark of something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a raw, unfiltered honesty that made me pause. "I need you to be sure, Evelyn. Not just about him, but about us," I said, the words hanging like a thread over a chasm. "I can't go through this again." "I am sure," she replied, voice firmer now. "But it's not enough for me to just say it. I know that. I need to show you." Her eyes glistened, the hint of tears that refused to fall. She took a step forward, closing the space between us, close enough that I could see the tiny scar above her eyebrow, the one she got from a clumsy fall when we first moved into this house. We stood there, neither of us moving, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator. It felt like a line had been drawn in the sand, a tentative step toward something new or the edge of an ending we'd been skirting for too long. "I'll stay," I said finally, the decision heavy but clear. "But this doesn't mean I forgive you yet. It just means I'm willing to see if we can make this work." Evelyn nodded, relief and sadness mingling in her expression. "That's all I ask," she whispered. The phone buzzed again, but this time neither of us looked at it. It was just a noise now, part of the past that was finally starting to fade. We moved forward like explorers navigating unfamiliar territory, taking tentative steps that could have been traps or bridges. The kitchen became neutral ground, our conversations polite but tinged with the awkwardness of two people learning how to speak to each other all over again. It was a fragile peace, breakable by a misplaced word or a sideways glance. One evening, Evelyn suggested we go out for dinner, her voice tight with nerves. The idea of facing the world together, of pretending to be a couple unfractured by betrayal, felt daunting. But I agreed. I knew staying home, surrounded by the familiar ghosts, was suffocating both of us. The restaurant was one we hadn't been to in years, a place where we used to celebrate small victories, promotions, birthdays, even the occasional Tuesday that called for a toast. Sitting across from her now, the warm, low lighting brought back those memories, bittersweet and sharp. The silence between us stretched like a thin wire, ready to snap. Our waitress approached, breaking the tension. She was young, with an easy smile that reminded me of how Evelyn used to smile before all of this. We ordered without thinking, old favorites that spoke of a routine now lost. When the waitress walked away, Evelyn reached for her water glass, fingers trembling slightly. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" she asked, voice hesitant. I nodded, the memory surfacing unbidden. "Your birthday. We stayed until they practically closed the place, sharing that ridiculous chocolate cake." Her lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile, but it faltered. "I keep thinking about what we used to have and how far we've let it slip away. It's like we were watching the same movie, but from different seats." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "When did it start for you?" The question wasn't just about Adrian. It was about the distance, the nights spent back-to-back in bed, the moments we'd let drift by without a fight. She looked down at the table, tracing the edge of her napkin. "I don't know," she said after a moment, eyes still fixed on the fabric. "Maybe when we stopped talking about things that mattered, or when I realized we were more comfortable in silence than in laughter." The rawness in her voice caught me off guard, chipping away at my resolve. I took a sip of my drink, trying to wash down the bitterness that lodged in my throat. "It wasn't just you," I admitted, the confession heavier than I expected. "I got caught up in work in the idea that if everything looked perfect on the outside, it would feel that way on the inside too. I didn't see how far apart we were drifting." She looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. It was the first time I'd acknowledged my role in this mess, and the weight of it made the air between us shift. The silence that followed was different, less tense, as if we'd laid the first piece of a bridge we both wanted to cross. The food arrived, steaming plates that filled the space between us with a familiar warmth. We ate slowly, the conversation inching towards safer ground. Plans for the weekend, whether we'd visit friends we hadn't seen in ages. It felt tentative, like trying out a language I hadn't spoken in years, but it was something. At the end of the meal, as the waitress set down the bill, Evelyn reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if seeking permission. I didn't pull away. Her fingers curled slightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself feel the weight of her presence without the shadow of what had happened. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even certainty. But it was a start, fragile and full of questions, and for now, that was enough. The days stretched into weeks, each one a cautious dance of tentative trust and quiet observations. We fell into a rhythm that, while not effortless, at least resembled normalcy. I noticed Evelyn rediscovering the small things she once loved, the soft hum of an old jazz record, tending to the plants by the window, the ones that had begun to wilt when our marriage did. And I, too, found myself pausing longer over morning coffee, taking in the familiar creases around her eyes when she smiled. But the shadow of what had happened was always there, lurking in the corners of conversations, in the quiet moments when a song would play that reminded me of that night at the gallery. We were making progress, sure, but it was like walking on thin ice. Every step felt like it could send us plunging back into the cold. One Saturday, Evelyn approached me in the kitchen, her eyes guarded but determined. "There's something I think we should do," she said, her fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I need to go back to the gallery." The words hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. I set down the knife I was using to chop vegetables, the sound sharp in the small room. "Why?" The question came out harsher than I intended, my chest tightening with a familiar mix of anger and fear. "Because I need to face it," she said, meeting my eyes with a steady resolve. "I need to show you that part of my life is over. And maybe we both need closure." I stared at her, searching for cracks in her determination, but there were none. It was the first time I saw how far she was willing to go to rebuild what we'd lost. Against my instincts, I nodded. "All right." The gallery was the same, its white walls stark against the bold splashes of color that filled them. But it felt different this time, stripped of the excitement and novelty that had once drawn her in. The space was quieter, with only a few patrons wandering between exhibits, their murmurs low and respectful. Evelyn led the way, her steps deliberate. I followed, my heartbeat a drum in my chest. We reached The Reckoning, Adrian's so-called masterpiece, and I felt a chill skitter down my spine. There she was, painted in tumultuous strokes, the woman caught between anguish and liberation. This was the portrait that had changed everything, and seeing it again made my hands clench at my sides. Evelyn stood before it, eyes scanning every detail as if seeing it for the first time. I watched her, watched the way she drew in a breath and let it out slowly, the tension easing from her frame. After a long pause, she turned to me. "I thought I saw myself in this," she said, voice steady. "The chaos, the longing. But I was wrong. It's not who I am. Not anymore." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't that simple. But another part, deeper and more weary, felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this was what moving forward looked like, standing face to face with the past and refusing to let it dictate the future. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the gallery. "For everything." I reached for her hand, hesitating for just a heartbeat before closing my fingers around hers. The warmth there was tentative but real. "Me too," I said, the weight of forgiveness beginning to settle into something more familiar, something I could carry. We stood there for a while, side by side in front of the painting that had once symbolized the breaking of us. Now, it was just paint on canvas, a story that didn't belong to us anymore. As we turned to leave, the storm that had loomed over us for so long began to ease, just a little, letting in slivers of light. It wasn't perfect. It might never be, but it was enough for now, and that was more than I could have asked for. The gallery visit marked a turning point. An invisible line crossed where the past loosened its chokehold, if only slightly. For the first time in months, I felt as though Evelyn and I were on the same side of the battlefield, no longer fighting each other, but the memory of what had happened. The nights grew warmer, and with them, our silences became less sharp, filled instead with the tentative sounds of rebuilding. But trust, I discovered, was not something that returned all at once. It crept in, shy and uncertain, testing the waters. There were still moments when I'd wake up to find the bed too empty, the whisper of doubt curling in my mind. And I knew Evelyn noticed. I could see it in the way she'd glance at me across the room, a question in her eyes that neither of us dared to voice. One evening, she suggested we go out for a drive. "No destination," she said, trying for a smile that almost reached her eyes. The spontaneity of it reminded me of us years ago, when late-night adventures were routine and we chased the sunrise just to feel alive. "All right," I said, surprising us both. The road stretched ahead, the city fading behind us as fields opened up on either side, dark and endless. The radio played softly, some old rock ballad that tugged at memories we both shared. Evelyn rolled down the window, the wind catching her hair and pulling it in wild, carefree waves. For the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed, a small, genuine sound that broke something loose inside me. "You remember that time we got lost trying to find that hiking trail?" she asked, turning to me, eyes sparkling with a nostalgia that made my chest tighten. I chuckled, the memory surfacing. "Yeah, and we ended up at that greasy diner instead, eating fries that tasted like cardboard. And we swore we'd never go hiking again," she said, the laughter fading into a silence that felt full, not empty. It was the kind of pause that allowed for reflection without the sting. The road led us up a gentle hill where we pulled over to a lookout point. The city lights glittered in the distance, tiny and insignificant, like a world far removed from where we were now. We sat on the hood of the car, the metal still warm beneath us, and listened to the crickets chirping in the quiet. The night felt suspended, holding its breath with us. "I know it's still there," Evelyn said after a while, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The doubt, the hurt, I can feel it every time we don't say what we're thinking." I stared at the horizon, the darkness blurring the line between earth and sky. It's there, I admitted, the honesty a balm and a burden. But it's changing. Slowly. She nodded, the weight of her own guilt evident in the slump of her shoulders. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm not sure I ever want you to, because that would mean we learn nothing. But I do want you to know that I'm here, Michael. All of me. Nos a dos. I turned to her, the sincerity in her eyes like an open book, every page raw and real. I reached for her hand, felt the coolness of her skin warming under my touch. We're not who we were, Evelyn. And maybe that's okay. Maybe this time we build something new. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she let it fall, unashamed. I'd like that, she said, voice breaking on the words. The wind whispered around us, carrying the scent of grass and summer promises. We sat there until the stars scattered overhead, tiny pinpricks in the vastness, reminders that even the dark could hold light. For the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was hope, and for now, that was more than enough. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after that night. There were still days when the doubts crept in, small and insidious, whispering that forgiveness was a lie and trust a fragile illusion. But we pressed on. Each morning was a choice, each shared glance a silent agreement to try, even when it felt like trudging through deep snow. It was on one of those days, when the sun flirted with the clouds, casting patches of gold across the living room, that Evelyn surprised me with an idea. She set down her mug, the chipped one she'd kept despite my offers to replace it, and looked at me with a mixture of determination and anxiety. I want us to start something together, she said, fingers tightening around the mug as if it were an anchor. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Like what? Art, she said, the word breaking the silence and carrying a weight that made me pause. Not the kind that divides us, but something we build together. A project, maybe. We could paint a mural or start a garden, something we both create from start to finish. I blinked, the surprise warming into something softer. It was unexpected, this proposal, but it felt like the first true step we'd taken toward reclaiming what was ours. A mural? I echoed, the idea blooming with hesitant excitement. You want me to paint? She smiled, and this time, it was genuine, touching the corners of her eyes. Why not? We don't have to be good at it. We just have to do it. The next weekend, we found ourselves in the garage, clearing space and dusting off old cans of paint from projects long abandoned. The sunlight streamed through the high window, highlighting Evelyn's hair as she pushed a box aside and grinned at me like she used to, years ago when the world was less complicated. We picked a wall on the side of the garage, hidden from the street, but open to our backyard. It felt symbolic, private, but not secret. The first strokes were awkward, tentative slashes of blue and green that didn't look like much of anything. But as the hours passed, laughter replaced the quiet. We teased each other over smudged lines and unexpected splatters, Evelyn accidentally streaking paint across my arm and me retaliating with a swipe of yellow on her cheek. By the time the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the yard, we were covered in paint, our clothes splattered, our hands sticky. But the wall before us had transformed, its chaos turning into something that looked surprisingly like hope. Swirls of color reached across it, shapes morphing into trees that connected under a sky of stars. We stood side by side, breathing in the sharp, heady scent of paint and dusk. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the fading light. "It's imperfect," she said, touching a spot where the lines blurred and bled into each other. "But it's ours." I nodded, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, smudging blue against her skin. She laughed, a sound that felt like a balm, mending the small fractures still embedded in my heart. "I think we're ready," I said, the words surprising even me. They carried more meaning than just the mural. They spoke of the choice we were making every day, the choice to try, to rebuild, to forgive. "Me too," she said softly, her gaze never leaving mine. That night, as the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I realized that this was what moving on looked like. Not perfect, not without scars, but full of intention. It was late, and the moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating us as we sat side by side, fingers interlaced and paint still drying on our skin. There were no more shadows between us, only the quiet understanding that the storm had passed, and we were still standing. It wasn't the same as before, but it was enough to make me believe that whatever came next, we would face it together.